In 1685, the family took possession of ivy-covered Chernow Castle, set prominently on windswept hills above the little seaside town of Stevenston. Today, just a mound of picturesque ruins, this stately pile then featured a great hall with graceful Gothic windows and came complete with its own balcony. Barony. The castle stands on the rather steep wooded bank of a small stream and overlooks a beautiful glen, wrote one newspaper while the structure stood intact. The castle's occupants enjoyed a fine, if often fog-bound view of the island of Arran, across the Firth of Clyde. Then, as now, the North Ayrshire countrysides consisted of gently rolling meadows that were well watered by streams and ponds. Cows and horses browsed upon largely treeless hillsides. At the time James Hamilton grew up in Chernow Castle, the family estate was so huge that it encompassed not just Stevenston, but half the arable land in the parish. Aside from the cottage industry of weavers and a small band of artisans who made Jews' harps, most local residents huddled in cold hovels, subsisted on a gruesome oatmeal diet, and eked out hard-scrabble lives as tenant farmers for the Hamiltons. For all his storybook upbringing in the castle and high-born pedigree, James Hamilton faced uncertain prospects. As the fourth son, he had little chance of ever inheriting the storied title of Laird of Grange. And like all younger brothers in this precarious spot, he was expected to go off and fend for himself. As his son Alexander noted, his father, as a younger son of a numerous family, was bred to trade. From the sketchy information that can be gleaned about James' siblings, it seems that he was the black sheep of the family, unmarked for mediocrity. While James had no formal education to speak of, two older and two younger brothers attended the University of Glasgow, and most of his siblings found comfortable niches in the world. Brother John financed manufacturing and insurance ventures. Brother Alexander became a surgeon, Brother Walter a doctor and apothecary, and Brother William a prosperous tobacco merchant, while Elizabeth married the surveyor of customs for Port Glasgow. Easygoing and lackadaisical, devoid of the ambition that would propel his spirited son, James Hamilton did not seem to internalize the Glaswegian ethos of hard work and strict discipline. One has the impression that his eldest brother John, now Laird of Grange, was no country squire running to hounds, but an active, enterprising man who was intensely involved in the banking, shipping, and textile business revolutionizing Glasgow. This cathedral and university town, rhapsodized by Daniel Defoe in their 1720s as the most beautiful little town in Britain, and already breathed a lovely commercial spirit of the sort that later appealed to Alexander Hamilton. After 1707, union with England, a Scottish trade with the North American and West Indian colonies boomed. Merchant princes grew rich trafficking in sugar, tobacco, and cotton. In November 1737, John Hamilton took the affable but feckless James, then 19, and steered him into a 4-year apprenticeship with an innovative Glasgow businessman named Richard Allen. Allen had executed a daring raid on Dutch industrial secrets, one that strikingly anticipates what Alexander Hamilton later attempted in bringing manufacturing to Paterson, New Jersey, and helped to pioneer the linen industry in Scotland with his Harlem linen and dye manufactory. In 1741, John Hamilton teamed up with Allen and 3 Glasgow grandees, Archibald Ingram, John Glassford, and James Detchman, to form the Glasgow Inkle Factory, which produced linen tapes, inkles, that were used in making lace. Hamilton's partners were the commercial royalty of Glasgow, who drove out in fancy coaches, presided over landed estates, and dominated the River Clyde with their oceaning vessels. For many years, these men would tirelessly bail out the hapless James Hamilton from recurrent financial scrapes. The onerous 4-year contract that James Hamilton signed with Richard Allen in 1737 was a form of legal bondage that obligated him to work as an apprentice and servant. John Hamilton paid Allen £45 to groom his younger brother in the textile trade. In exchange, James would receive room, board, and fresh linen in the Allen household, but no guaranteed holidays or free weekend time. John Hamilton must have thought that he was shepherding the wayward James into a promising industry. In time, the linen industry indeed proved profitable. But during this startup phase, it was a dispiriting, money-draining proposition. So when the apprenticeship agreement expired in 1741, James Hamilton decided to test his luck in the West Indies. Many young aristocrats flocked to the West Indian sugar islands. Seduced by a common fantasy, they would amass a quick fortune as planters or merchants, then return to Europe flush with cash and snap up magnificent estates. The Glasgow side was studded with the country houses of winners in the sweepstakes. Great shiploads of sugar traveled from the West Indian islands to Glasgow's boiling houses, or refineries, and its distilleries produced brandy from that sugar. Beyond the sugar trade, industrious Scots also operated stores that sold provisions to plantations and marketed their produce. One historian has noted, their emporiums were crammed with full lines of European and North American goods, hardware, draperies, clothing, shoes, and whatnot, and much resembled warehouses. Of all the Caribbean islands, a few enjoy more intimate connections with the Glasgow than St. Christopher and the Leeward Islands, commonly known as St. Kitts. More than half of the island's original land grants were awarded to the Scots. As the son of a Scottish laird, James Hamilton must have started out with a modicum of social cachet in St. Kitts, but it was never enhanced by business or money success. Trading sugar or plantation supplies in the West Indies was hazardous to those with skimpy capital. Clients demanded credit from these middlemen, who had to carry the risk for merchandise until it was resold in Europe. Meanwhile, they had to pay their sugar duties. The slightest error in calculation or payment delay could swap a trader in catastrophic losses. From such fate probably overtook James Hamilton, who faltered quickly and had to be rescued repeatedly by his brother John and his Glasgow friends. In capacity of a merchant, he went to St. Kitts, where from too generous and too easy a temper he failed in business and at length fell into indigent circumstances. His son Alexander wrote in tactful tones. He spoke of his father in a forgiving tone, tinged with pity rather than scorn. It was his fault to have too much pride, and too large a portion of indolence, but his character was otherwise without reproach, and his manners those of a gentleman. In short, Hamilton saw his father as amiable, but lazily inept. He inherited his father's pride, though not his indolence, and his exceptional capacity for work was its own unspoken commentary about his father's. James Hamilton had little notion that his protective older brother was acting as his lender of last resort, for John exhorted his brother's creditors to mask his role, cautioning one creditor in 1749, "My brother does not know I am engaged for him." From John Hamilton's letters, one senses that James was distant, even estranged from his family. The last letter his mother had from him was some time ago, where he writes he had bills, but at the time they were not due. John disclosed in one letter to a business associate. Perhaps embarrassed by his perennial bungling, James seems to have concealed the scope of his financial troubles. That James Hamilton's career likely lay in ruins before Rachel Fawcett Lavian materialized is suggested by the minutes of the St. Kitts Council meeting of July 15, 1748, which reported that he had taken the oath of either a watchman or a weighman. Insects have unfortunately eaten the middle letters. For the port of Basseterre, in the island's capital. So of his stint in the tropics, meant to be a fleeting money-making interlude, it had begun to turn into a permanent trap instead. Many young European fortune seekers expecting to return home would take a temporary black or mulatto mistress and defer marriage until safely back on native soil. That his plans had drastically miscarried would have made James Hamilton more receptive to a romantic liaison with a separated European woman now that he knew he was not going to see Scotland again anytime soon. By the time Rachel met James Hamilton for sure in St. Kitts in the early 1750s, a certain symmetry had shaped their lives. They were both scarred by early setbacks, had suffered a vertiginous descent in social standing, and had grappled with the terrors of downward economic mobility. Each would have been excluded from more rarefied society from the British West Indies and tempted to choose a mate from the limited population of working whites. Their liaison was the sort of match that could easily produce a son, hypersensitive about class and status and painfully conscious that social hierarchies ruled the world. Divorce was a novelty in the 18th century. To obtain one in the Crown Colonies was an expensive, torturous affair, and this deprived James and Rachel of any chance to legitimize their match. Putting the best face on the embarrassing situation, Alexander sometimes pretended that his parents had married. Of Rachel's flight from St. Croix, he declared, "My mother afterwards went to St. Kitts, became acquainted with my father, and a marriage between them ensued, followed by many years' cohabitation and several children." Since the relationship may have lasted 15 years, it presumably took on the trappings of a marriage, enabling Alexander to maintain that his legitimacy was a mere legal technicality and had nothing to do with negligent or profligate parents. Indeed, Hamilton's parents, though a common-law couple, presented themselves as James and Rachel Hamilton. They had 2 sons, James Jr. and 2 years later, Alexander, since Hamilton spoke of his mother's bearing several children, and other siblings may have died in childhood. The personalities of James and Rachel Hamilton evoked by Alexander's descendants have a slightly unreal, even sanitized quality. Hamilton's own son, John, conjured up Rachel as a woman of superior intellect, elevated sentiment, and unusual grace of a person and manner. To her he was indebted for his genius. Perhaps no less fanciful was the paternal portrait daubed by Hamilton's grandson, Alan McLean Hamilton. Hamilton's father does not appear to have been successful in any pursuit, but in many ways was a great deal of a dreamer, and something of a student, whose chief happiness seemed to be in the society of his beautiful and talented wife, who was in every way intellectually his superior. In this cozy domestic scene based on credible oral history or family public relations, the documentary record is, alas, mute. The one inescapable impression that we have is that Hamilton received his brains and implacable willpower from his mother, not from his errant, indolent father. On the other hand, his father's Scottish ancestry enabled Alexander to daydream that he was not merely a West Indian outcast consigned forever to a lowly status, but an aristocrat in disguise, waiting to declare his true identity and act his part on a grander stage. Few questions evil Hamilton biographers more than the baffling matter of his year of birth. For a long time, historians accepted 1757, the year used by Hamilton himself and his family, yet several cogent pieces of evidence from his Caribbean period have caused recent historians to opt for 1755. In 1766, Hamilton affixed his signature as the witness to a legal document, a dubious honor if he was only 9. In 1768, a probate court in St. Croix reported his age as 13, highly compelling evidence, since it did not rely on his testimony but came from his uncle. When Alexander published a poem in St. Croix newspaper in 1771, the aspiring bard informed the editor, "Sir, I am a youth about 17," an adolescent's way of stating that he was 16, which would also tally with the 1755 date. The massive evidence from the period after Alexander Hamilton's arrival in North America does suggest 1757 as his birth year, but preferring the integrity of contemporary over retrospective evidence, we will opt here for a birthday of January 11, 1755. From her father, Rachel had inherited a waterfront property on the main street of Charleston, the Nevis capital where legend proclaims that Alexander was born and lived as a boy. If so, he would have seen off to the left the town anchorage and a bright expanse of water, crowded with slave and cargo ships. Off to the right lay the rugged foothills and dim brown mountains of St. Kitts. Appropriately enough, this boy, destined to be America's foremost Anglophile, entered the world as a British subject, born on the British side in the reign of George II. He was slight and thin-shouldered and distinctly Scottish in appearance, with a florid complexion, reddish brown hair, and sparkling violet blue eyes. One West Indian mentor, who remembered Hamilton as bookish and rather delicate and frail, marveled that he had mustered the later energy for his strenuous American exploits. Like everyone in the West Indies, Hamilton had an extensive early exposure to blacks. In this highly stratified society, with its many gradations of caste and color, even poor white owned slaves and hired them for extra income. In 1756, 1 year after Hamilton was born, his grandmother Mary Fawcett, now residing on the Dutch island of St. Eustatius, made her final will and left "my 3 dear slaves, Rebecca, Flora, and Esther," to her daughter Rachel. Hamilton probably did not have formal schooling on Nevis. His illegitimate birth may well have barred him from Anglican instruction, but he seems to have had individual tutoring. His son later related that, rarely as he alluded to his personal history, he mentioned with a smile his having been taught to repeat the Decalogue in Hebrew at the school of a Jewish, when so small that he was placed standing by her side upon a table. This charming vignette squares with 2 known facts. Elderly women in the Caribbean commonly tutored children, and Nevis having a thriving problem of Sephardic Jews. Many of them had escaped persecution in Brazil and had entered the local sugar trade. By the 1720s, they constituted 1/4 of Charlestown's white population and created a synagogue, a school, and a well-kept cemetery that survives to this day. His French Huguenot mother may also have instructed Hamilton, for he was comfortably bilingual and later was more at ease in French than Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, and other American diplomats who had spent years struggling to master the tongue in Paris. Perhaps from this exposure at an impressionable young age, Hamilton harbored a lifelong reverence for Jews. In later years, he privately jotted on a sheet of paper that the progress of the Jews, from their earliest history to the present time, has been and is entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause is also an extraordinary one? In other words, that is, if the effect of some great providential plan, later on, in the heat of a renowned legal case, Hamilton challenged the opposing counsel. Why distrust the evidence of the Jews? Discredit them and you destroy the Christian religion. Were not the Jews witnesses of that pure and holy, happy and heaven-approved faith converts to that faith? For a boy with Hamilton's fertile imagination, Nevis's short history must have furnished a rich storehouse of material. He was well situated to witness the clash of European powers, with incessant skirmishes among French, Spanish, and English ships, and swarms of marauding pirates and privateers. The Admiralty Court sat in Nevis, which meant that swaggering buccaneers in manacles were dragged into the local courthouse before proper hanging in Gallows Bay. While some pirates were just plain freebooters, many were discreetly backed by warring European nations. perhaps instructing Hamilton in the way that foreign powers can tamper with national sovereignty. Periodically, cutthroats came ashore for duels, resorting to conventional pistols or slashing one another with heavy cutlasses, thrilling fare for any boy. Blood feuds were routine affairs in the West Indies. Plantation society was a feudal order, predicated on personal honor and dignity, making duels popular among whites who fancied themselves noblemen. As in the American South, an exaggerated sense of romantic honor would have been an unconscious way for slaveholders to flaunt their moral superiority, purge pent-up guilt, and cloak the British nature of their trade. To the extent that dueling entranced Hamilton into an unhealthy degree, this fascination may have been originated in the most fabled event in Nevis in the 1750s. In 1752, John Barbot, a young Nevis lawyer, and Matthew Mills, a wealthy planter from St. Kitts, were bickering over a land deal when Mills lashed out at Barbot as an impertinent puppy, the sort of fighting words that prompted duels. One day at dawn, elegantly clad in a silver-laced hat and white coat, Barbot was rowed over to St. Kitts by a slave boy. At a dueling ground at Frigate Bay, he encountered Mills, lifted his silver-mounted pistol, and slaughtered him at close range. At the sensational murder trial, it was alleged that Barbot had gunned down Mills before the latter had a chance to grab his pistol from his holster. The star witness was Dr. William Hamilton, a possible relation of James Hamilton, who testified that Mills had been shot from the side, and therefore must have been ambushed. Certain elements of this trial almost creepily foreshadowed the fatal clash between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Barbot, well-bred yet debt-ridden, sneered at the soft-hearted notion that he had murdered the popular Mills, claiming that he had killed him fairly according to the notions of honor prevailing among men. Barbot insisted that Mills had aimed his pistol at him, even as he absorbed the fatal bullet. As was to happen with Aaron Burr, locals testified that Barbot, in ungentlemanly fashion, had taken target practices in the preceding weeks. Barbot was eventually convicted and packed off to the gallows. Nevis children, such as Hamilton, who were born 3 years later, would have savored every gory detail of the history. Violence was commonplace in Nevis, as in the slave-ridden Sugar Lands. The 8,000 captive blacks easily dwarfed in number the 1,000 whites, a disproportion, remarked one visitor, which necessarily converts all such white men as are not exempted by age and decrepitude into a well-regulated militia. Charlestown was a compact town of narrow, crooked lanes and wooden buildings, and Hamilton would regularly have passed the slave auction blocks at Market Shop and across his alley and beheld barbarous whippings in the public square. The Caribbean sugar economy was a system of inimitable savagery, making the tobacco and cotton plantations of the American South seem almost genteel by comparison. The mortality rate of slaves hacking away at sugarcane under a pitiless tropical sun was simply staggering. 3 out of 5 died within 5 years of arrival, and slave owners needed to replenish their fields constantly with fresh victims. One Nevis planter, Edward Huggins, set a sinister record when he administered 365 lashes to a male slave and 292 to a female. Evidently unfazed by this sadism, a local jury acquitted him of all wrongdoing. A decorous British lady who visited St. Kitts and stared aghast at a naked male and female slaves being driven along dusty roads by overseers who flogged them at regular intervals, as if they needed steady reminder of their servitude. Every 10 Negroes have a driver who walks behind them, holding in his hand a short whip and a long one, and you constantly observe where the application has been made. Another British visitor said that if a white man kills a black, he cannot be tried for his life or for the murder. If a Negro strikes a white man, he is punishable with the loss of his hand, and if he should draw blood, with death. Island life contained enough blood-curdling scenes to darken Hamilton's vision for death, Hamilton's vision for life, instilling an ineradicable pessimism about human nature that infused all his writing. All of the horror was mingled incongruously with the natural beauty of turquoise waters, flaming sunsets, and languid palm fronds. In this geologically active zone, the hills bubbled with high sulfur hot springs that later became tourist meccas. The sea teemed with lobster, snapper, grouper, and conch, while the jungles were alive with parrots and mongooses. There were also monkeys galore, green vervets shipped from Africa earlier in the century. Many travelers prized the island as a secluded refuge, one finding it so captivating that he contended that if a man came there with his wife, he might linger forever in the sweet recess of Nevis. It was all very pleasant and balmy, supremely beautiful and languid. If you were white, were rich, and turned a blind eye to the black population, expiring in the canebrakes. If Rachel thought that Joanne Michael Lavian's appetite for revenge had been sated in Christiansted, she was sadly disabused of this notion in 1759. 9 years after Rachel had fled St. Croix, Lavian surfaced for one final lesson in retribution. Oppressed by debt, he had been forced to cede his most recent plantation to two Jewish money lenders and support himself as a plantation overseer while renting out his little clutch of slaves. In the interim, he had begun living with a woman who took in washing to boost their income. It may have been Lavian's wish to marry this woman that abruptly prompted him to obtain an official divorce summons from Rachel on February 26, 1759. In a document, Something with Outrage, Lavian branded Rachel a scarlet woman given to a sinful life. Having failed to mend her ways after imprisonment, the decree stated Rachel had absented herself from Lavian for 9 years and gone elsewhere, where she has begotten several illegitimate children, so that such action is believed to be more sufficient for him to obtain a divorce from her. Lavian noted bitterly that he himself had taken care of Rachel's legitimate child from what little he has been able to earn, whereas she completely forgotten her duty and let her husband and child alone instead of giving herself up to whoring with everyone, which things the plaintiff says are so well known that her family and friends must hate her for it. After this vicious indictment, Lavian demanded that Rachel be denied all legal rights to his property. He warned that if he died before her, Rachel, as a widow, would possibly seek to take possession of the estate and therefore not only acquire what she ought not to have, but also take this away from his child and give it to her poor children. That was how Lavian designated Alexander and his brother whore children. He was determined to preserve his wealth for his one legitimate son, 13-year-old Peter. Rachel was undoubtedly stunned by the unforeseen vendetta. This throwback to a nightmarish past. Summoned to appear in court in St. Croix, she must have feared further reprisals from Lavian and did not show up or refute the allegations. On June 25th, Lavian received a divorce that permitted him to remarry, while Rachel was strictly prohibited from doing so. The Danish authorities took such decrees seriously and fined or dismissed any clergymen who married couples in defiance of such decisions. In one swiftly effective stroke, Lavian had safeguarded his son's inheritance and penalized Rachel, making it impossible for her two innocent sons ever to mitigate the stigma of illegitimacy. However detestable Lavian's actions, two things should be said in his defense. Rachel had relinquished responsibility for Peter and forced Lavian to bring up the boy alone. Also, Lavian subsequently witnessed legal documents for the Leidens. Rachel's St. Croix in-laws, suggesting that her own family may have been her life as less than blameless. In view of this lacerating history, Rachel probably never imagined that she would return to St. Croix, but a confluence of events changed that. In the early 1760s, Lavian moved to Frederikstead, on the side of St. Croix from Christiansted, and dabbled in real estate. Then, around 1764, Peter moved to South Carolina, so when James Hamilton received a business assignment in Christiansted in April 1765, he would have taken along Rachel and the two boys without fearing any untoward collisions with Lavian. James Hamilton had continued to feed off his gram of St. Kitts, the son of a Glasgow tobacco lord of the same name. The Ingrams asked James to collect a large debt due from a man named Alexander Moore, who was returning to Europe and denied owing the money. The resulting lawsuit was drawn on until January 1766. In the meantime, Rachel and the boys took up residence in Christiansted. Thrust back into the world of her former disgrace, Rachel lived blocks from the fort, where she had been jailed and no longer had the liberty of posing as Mrs. Hamilton. On the St. Croix tax rolls, she shows up under misspelled variants of Fawcett and Lavian. Stripped of whatever cover of her legitimacy had sheltered them, it would have become glaringly evident to Alexander and James Jr. for the times that they were natural children, and that their mother had been a notorious woman. James Hamilton scored an apparent victory in the Moore case, then left St. Croix and deserted his family forever. Why this sudden exit? Did Rachel's scandalous reputation cause a rift in the relationship? Did Lavian conduct a smear campaign and poison the air with innuendo? These scenarios seem unlikely given that James Hamilton never appeared on the St. Croix tax rolls, suggesting that he knew all along that he was a transient visitor. Alexander offered a forgiving but plausible reason for his father's desertion. He could no longer afford to support his family, because James Jr., 12, and Alexander, 10, had attained an age where they could assist Rachel, James Sr. may have believed that he could wash his hands of paternal duties without undue pangs of guilt. More in sorrow than malice, Alexander wrote a Scottish kinsman 30 years later. You no doubt have understood that my father's affairs at a very early day went to wreck, so as to have rendered his situation during the greatest part of his life uneligible. This state of things occasioned a separation between him and me when I was very young. Alexander probably never set eyes on his vagabond father, who stayed in the Caribbean, either lured by the indolent tropic tempo or ground down by poverty. Father and son never entirely lost touch with each other, but a curious detachment and estrangement, as much as psychological as geographical, separated them. As we shall see, there is a possible reason why James Hamilton may have felt less than paternal towards his son, and Alexander less than filial toward him.